afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. I'm Sally Whipple, and I'm the Director of Education and Community Programming here. And I'm so glad that you've decided to join us for one of our lunchtime programs. We do a free lunchtime program every month, and it's great to have you in our audience. We like to do these programs mixing history with current issues so that we can give you something interesting to think about and talk about with your friends. We hope you'll come back for other programs later this year. In September, UConn's new president, Susan Herbst, will join us for a conversation with Diane Smith. In October, David Corrigan from the Museum of Connecticut History will be here, and he'll be talking about the portraits of two governors that were actually removed from the State House because they opposed the Civil War. And we'll also have in November Dr. Matthew Warshauer, author of Connecticut in the Civil War, and he will join others to explore the issue of PTSD, which was called Soldier's Heart at the time of the Civil War. In between these programs, we hope you'll come back to the Old State House and look around. We have a lot here. Some of it is pretty standard, like great historically preserved rooms, the Senate chambers, the House chambers. We have this wonderful courtroom. We also have Mark Twain's bicycle, an antique fire truck, and a two-headed calf. And I guarantee you, you can't see those things together anywhere else on earth. So we hope you'll come back and bring your friends. We also have a lot of stories to tell at the Old State House. Mainly, we focus on people who took civic action on behalf of a cause that they believed in. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed, but they thought hard, they learned how the system of government worked, and they really worked hard to change things. Today, we're going to look at civic action in various forms. First of all, we'll meet Connecticut soldiers who fought in the Civil War and in wars of the 20th and 21st centuries. You'll also meet Dr. Matthew Warshauer, who has promoted the remembrance of Connecticut's role in the Civil War by writing a book and doing new research, and also by working to help create a commission to commemorate our state's role in the Civil War. You're going to meet CCSU students, Owen Rogers and Brianna McGuckin, whose work has helped discover and preserve soldiers' stories through the Veterans History Project, which is a collaboration between CCSU and the Library of Congress. And right now, you'll learn a little bit about our co-sponsor on this project, Connecticut Explored. This is an incredible, readable, and interesting Connecticut magazine that's filled with pictures and stories of Connecticut history. And this was started by a group of people who had a dream, which was to start a magazine that taught people about Connecticut, and they succeeded. It's a wonderful magazine, and they're helping us co-sponsor this event today. This is going to be a fantastic program, and we will ensure that when it's over, you're going to turn to your friend and say, I wish I could see this again. And you're in luck, because you can. All of our programs are taped by the Connecticut Network, so when you get home tonight, you can point your computer to ct-n.com, and you can see a listing of when this program will be aired, and you can also watch it on demand online. You can also take your own form of civic action today, and this is very important. The Old State House belongs to everybody, and so we really try to meet your needs and interests in the programming that you do. So you have a survey at your seat. Some of you are using it to fan yourselves because it's a little bit warm, but after this program, we would like you to fill out that form and tell us more of what you would like us to do here at the Old State House. And now, with all of that business taken care of, I would like to introduce Dr. Matthew Warshauer, who some of us call Civil Warshauer, because he has done a lot to help us understand our state's role, our very complicated role in the Civil War. And today he will introduce the students who will share this program with you. Matt?
Let me begin by, I just want to say thank you to Sally for having me here today. I've spoken many, many times at the Old State House, and it's always one of my favorite places to go, simply because of it's a centerpiece of state history and of Hartford history, and this is a very, very special building, and there's an amazing amount of things that have happened in this place. So every time I come here, I feel like I'm a part of the city's history. What I want to talk to you about today is something very, very specific in regards to the Civil War. There's so many Civil War topics, and state Civil War topics that, I could go on probably much longer than you would ever want me to, on a wide variety of different things. But this is a very, very focused subject today. And it's focused for a couple of reasons. Certainly one, because the history of the Civil War monuments in Connecticut is particularly interesting. It's one of the things that, when I first started researching, I didn't really have that great an interest in. I didn't really understand it that well. And I've come to understand it much better, and I've come to be far, far more interested in monuments than I ever thought I would be. I now see them, and you will too after today. You will literally see Civil War monuments everywhere you go. I have also, this is also a particularly interesting and special program because of the connection that it makes with contemporary America. If you would think for just a moment, how is it that we honor, we remember, we commemorate service to the nation and sacrifice? If you think about that for a moment, it's far, far more than just an historical idea. Every once in a while, over the past months and years, we have been driving along, maybe we go in front of a post office, maybe we go in front of a school, and we see a flag at half-mast. And what that tells us, for those of us who know, we immediately know somebody in the service of Connecticut, most likely a service member, has died in service to their nation. Every time a soldier dies in Afghanistan or Iraq, in some other part of the world, our flags throughout the country go to half-mast. That's one of the ways that we recognize the death of somebody who has given their life in the service of our nation. And, the issue of military can be a complicated thing, and it can be controversial. And, some people in this audience may have very, very different ideas about what we should or should not be doing around the world in terms of the military. But no matter what your opinions are in that regard, you do have to think about, and you do have to at least recognize that there's a lot of men and women who have given their time and their devotion for something that is bigger than themselves, to represent and to defend the nation. And that, as I said, can be a complicated thing, but it is an honorable thing. And, one of my nephews, who I just saw a couple of weeks ago, was on R&R from his second tour in Afghanistan, and we got a chance to talk about what his experiences were. And, so if you know somebody who's serving the nation, it gives you that extra connection. And that connection can go far, far back in history. I know some people who are here, my friend Frank, who's been following me everywhere for my talks around this day. He's got ancestors that served in the Connecticut 14th Regiment, which is the most storied regiment from the state of Connecticut. They saw more fierce battles than any other regiment in the entire state during the Civil War. But when you think about that idea of monuments, of how do we remember, how do we look back, how do we remember, it comes all the way into the present with how we think about, those flags that are flying half-staff. In the aftermath of 9/11, we are still in the midst in New York City of making what Americans hope is a fitting memorial to those thousands of people who lost their lives in the 9/11 attacks. In the state of Connecticut, we have 3 9/11 monuments, memorials that are in this state alone. Well, now go backwards, Civil War period. We have in the state of Connecticut over 130 Civil War monuments. That is more than any other type of monument of any kind in the state of Connecticut. That in itself is a remarkable thing, and it is a testament to how severe the Civil War really was. I think even if you don't know a lot about the Civil War, when you hear the word Civil War, you immediately think, wow, that was big. And that's the right response, because you have 620,000 Americans who died during the Civil War. And now there's obvious reasons for these big numbers, because Americans are killing Americans, right? I mean, that's the reason. But that's just the deaths. Now think about the number of casualties. 55,000 men go forward from war in the state of Connecticut. 10% of them are killed. Many, many more are wounded. They have lifelong ailments from disease and sickness. That's just the soldiers. Now think about the home front, where all of Connecticut, and I mean all of Connecticut, is engaged and involved in the war effort. You cannot go to any corner of this state and not see the elements of war and preparing and maintaining this large civil war that goes on for 4 solid years. And it drains communities. It saps them of their resources. It saps them of their energy, their emotion. It is a traumatic period in American history, and this is why we have the monuments, because they are a way of communal healing. They're a way in the aftermath of the war for people to come together and to try and make some sense of the catastrophe of this war. When it's all said and done, it's not so simple to just say, for the North especially, oh, we won, isn't that great, and now everything is going to be good. There is a lot of healing that has to go on, and the monuments are, I would argue to you, our most tangible living legacy to the Civil War period. And there are, a dozen monuments within a 15-minute walk from this building. And this building, again, I started off by talking about the historical importance of this building. If you walk outside, and I guarantee Governor Buckingham, who was the governor of the state during the entire Civil War, was standing on that balcony speaking to crowds of people, because this is the place where people gathered to hear information and to hear news. When I was researching my book, I came across more articles and news stories that mentioned the State House. They didn't call it the old State House at the time, though I think Sally was still working here then. So, but this is the place that people gathered. They came here to find out what the news. So it's fitting that we talk about the history of the memorials. So, citizens of Connecticut, sons of the fathers, to arms, to arms. Here we go. So, the very first slide that I want to show you is this is one of the 6 oldest monuments in the state of Connecticut. It is in Litchfield County. It's in a place called Northfield. I show you this one first. It was erected in 1866, and I show you this one first because it's my personal favorite. And if you've seen any of our Civil War commemoration T-shirts, it's what's on the back, and I had to lobby hard for that. It says that the generations to come might know them. That's why it's my favorite monument. Monuments say a lot of different things, but all of them, or not all of them, but many, many of the monuments are trying to point to this simple idea, that the generations to come might know them. We're well aware of the World War II and the idea of the greatest generation, right? We all have heard this phrase before. I said in an op-ed in the Hartford Courant that the Civil War generation didn't desire to be the greatest generation, they just desired to be remembered. They put this on their monuments, or something like this on their monuments. Much of the time you'll see things like the sacrifice was not in vain, things like that, because they are trying to both convince themselves and tell us, literally us, you, that this period and this sacrifice mattered, that people gave up their lives and put their lives in danger for a reason, to save the nation so that it would not split apart. None of you need a passport to go to Georgia, do you? Steve does. The Civil War is why, because we did not allow the nation to be split in two. So that the generations to come might know them. You will see, here's the Fuller Monument. You can see that it has Lincoln on the bottom, and it's got a finial flame. This is called an obelisk. You guys all know what an obelisk is. You've driven by them in every single cemetery. An obelisk is what the Washington Monument is. It's a large stone structure. This one is granite. They're often made of sandstone. Much of the granite and sandstone are quarried right here in Connecticut. They are fashioned by Connecticut monument manufacturers. And so the original monuments are all obelisks. And all of the first monuments, meaning about the first 6 to 7, are all placed either right in graveyards or right next to churches. This is on the town green in Northfield, which was adjacent to the First Congregational Church. And there's a reason why they're using obelisks and placing them where they do, because they were monuments to death. And an obelisk is a very, very fitting funerary design. And then they place them close to a place of worship because that's the connection to honoring death. So you can see that at the bottom that it lists the names of soldiers who died in battle. And you can see this one was erected in September 1866. And now we switch to a particularly unique monument. And this is the Kensington Monument in Berlin. It was erected on July 28th, 1863. You can see again that it is an obelisk. It is a sandstone obelisk. This monument is particularly unique because not only is it the first Civil War monument in the state of Connecticut, erected in 1863 in the midst of the war, it is the oldest Civil War monument in the entire North. Okay? There are only 2 other monuments that are older than this. The other 2 are both in Kentucky. One has been moved from its original site and is being repaired right now. The other is in a specific spot that we can't figure out, we meaning historians and preservationists, can't figure out the exact date that the second monument was erected in Kentucky. They said it was the summer of 1863. So this is either a really close second, or it's actually the oldest permanent monument in the entire country, which I think makes it quite remarkable. When I tell Civil War people, especially from the South, those who are from the South, I was talking to a guy from the Civil War Preservation Trust, and I said, well, we have this old monument. He didn't even know that it existed, that we had a monument that was this old in the state of Connecticut. And again, it's right next to the Congregational Church. You can see the church in the background there. And it's easily something that you could, if you weren't paying attention, it's easily something you could drive by and miss. It's sitting on the edge of the green. You could drive by it like that. But once you know it's there, it's almost like a magnet to your eyes. One of the interesting things, and I know the pictures don't come up perfectly, they're a little better on the computer, but this is actually the Connecticut State Seal. You will see this on quite a number of Connecticut monuments, Civil War monuments. And you can see the seal, you can see the 3 grapevines on there, and you can see below it, Que transtulit sustine, the state motto. That which transplanted is sustained. You'll see this on quite a number of the monuments. This says at the bottom of the monument, erected to commemorate the death of those who perished in suppressing the Southern Rebellion. This is another one of the ways that you can date Civil War monuments. They didn't until about the mid to late 1880s, they didn't start using the term Civil War. They always used the term War of Southern Rebellion or War between the states or War to save the Union. If you go down south, it is known as, and I got to get the accent right, the War of Northern Aggression. Not only do you have to get the accent right, you have to say it with a certain degree of attitude. It's very, very important. And our Robert E. Lee is here, and so I better get this right or he's going to report me to the Confederate forces. So you get the idea, to commemorate those who perished in the rebellion. This was a plaque that was placed on this monument during the 1960s for the 100th anniversary, the centennial commemoration. This is another one of the very old monuments in Connecticut. This one is in Bristol. It is at West Cemetery. And the first time I went to see this a number of years ago, all I knew was that it was on the highest hill of West Cemetery, which actually made it quite easy for me to find because I drove into the cemetery and just continued going uphill. And there it sat. And again, it is an obelisk. I'll show you the top. It's got a sculpted eagle on the top. It was January 20th, 1866. This was actually created by James Batterson, who was the founder of Travelers Insurance. And he had made his fortune in the stone and quarrying business. And you'll see on this that it says, at the top, it says Antietam. On the bottom, it says Andersonville. I have said to many, many people, you can actually tell the entire story of the American Civil War and Connecticut's involvement in it simply by learning about the monuments themselves, because they list the names of the soldiers, the places they fought, the places that were important to them. Many, many men from the 16th and the 14th fought and are listed on, especially the 16th, are listed on this monument. Antietam was their baptism of fire. They arrived with about 2 to 3 weeks worth of training. They barely know how to fire their guns, and they arrived at Antietam, which was the single bloodiest day in American history. 23,000 casualties in a single day. They were literally mowed down. And so Antietam, it's etched in stone so no one will ever forget. Andersonville, the 16th, they finally, escape the battles of war in the middle of the country, and they go down to North Carolina, and they end up getting captured in April of 1864. 400 of them go to Andersonville Prison. 200 of them survive. And so again, Andersonville, etched in stone so that no one ever forgets this. You can see at the base of this, you can see not only on that top edge, they've inlaid stone cannonballs into it, but you can also see up at the top, you can see two shields there. And if you see them a little bit closer, they are the Connecticut shield. Again, you can see 3 grapevines there. And on the right side is the Union shield. And the Union shield may actually be in your pocket right now. If you stick your hand in your pocket and look for some pennies, many of the new pennies that are being minted right now actually have the old Union shield. And they're, it's just one of the things that the mint is trying to do to kind of connect us to history. But you'll see on many of the monuments, you'll see the Connecticut shield and the Union shield. This is a small stone that sits right in front of this Bristol Monument to the unknown dead. Okay? We have this in every war. Men who disappear and we don't know what happened to them. And it doesn't mean that a marker shouldn't exist. Where I live in West Hartford, I can walk out on my front lawn, look down the street, and see the Old North Cemetery, and in that cemetery is a Civil War marker that is to the men who never returned home. And you'll see these kinds of markers in quite a number of places throughout Connecticut because the death tolls were so high on Civil War battlefields, it was very oftentimes that they weren't able to clean these battlefields off and people were thrown in mass graves and they just never made it home. And, there's just a story not long ago, a few weeks ago, of a soldier from the Korean War whose DNA was finally identified and he was returned home to be placed to be interred. So we still have this mission. It extends throughout, throughout our society to return men who have gone to war, to return them home and make sure that their graves are properly marked. One of the interesting things also about Bristol is that on this past Memorial Day, they erected a brand new Civil War monument directly on the Memorial Boulevard there. And this is one of the things that's also interesting in the history of monuments overall, is that I said the early monuments were all placed either directly next to churches or in graveyards. And then as the parks movement began in the late 19th century, as people started creating, parks that people would go and spend time in. Graveyards were actually a place that people would go and picnic and use for recreational areas. And I know that sounds weird today, but it was very, very common. It's why they have beautiful architecture and beautiful landscaping. As the parks movement started, less and less people went to graveyards and to cemeteries, and therefore the people who were founding and erecting these monuments decided, you know what? We need to start making the monuments in a more centralized location, on town greens, in town centers, in the middle of cities, so that the people keep their connection. There was also controversy over actually moving some of the monuments and the markers from cemeteries to other more public places. And so there's a whole history of that goes along with this. And the new Bristol Monument gives you that idea that the people are still connected to this war and are still interested in it and still want to commemorate it. So this is North Branford Soldiers Monument, April 12th, 1866. April 12th, of course, is the anniversary of the firing on Fort Sumter. Again, this is one of the oldest monuments in Connecticut, a granite structure, a simple obelisk at the bottom. It just simply says 1865, our soldiers. Oops, I think I skipped one. Here is the Cheshire Monument. Very similar. It's got a bronze plaque on the front that lists the soldiers who served. You can see that a little bit closer. Erected to the memory of those who enlisted from the town of Cheshire in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Now, what's interesting about this is the monument is 1866. The plaque, the bronze plaque, is put on much later, and why it says Civil War. And there was actually controversy about this because originally on the monument they only put the names of men who died during the war. Later on, they decided, as Civil War veterans started dying, they decided, we've got to add all of the names of the men who served. And this has continued to be a bit controversial up to the last number of years. There are a couple of different monument projects that are going on right now, and the organizations that are creating these monuments are trying to decide whose name do they put on. Do they put on men who are listed as deserters? Do they not? Why did they desert? Did they actually desert? I mean, there's controversy about that. When Barkhamsted did a monument about 8 years ago, they dealt with exactly those issues. So again, you know, the kind of history of the monuments and what goes into making a monument and how you erect it and who you include on it gets into very touchy issues sometimes. Again, here's another aspect of the Cheshire Monument, and you can see that it says Lincoln on the bottom. Obviously, the first president to have been assassinated in the country, and certainly a martyr to the Civil War, and you'll find his name on many, many monuments throughout the country. This is a particularly unique monument. It's getting a little bit later in the period, and Civil War monuments, when I say in the period, Civil War monuments are erected from 1863, and then you get that first one, and then you get a wave, 1866, all the way through the 1930s. And there's no one single building period. We can't say, oh, well, most monuments went up in 1880 to 1890. There is just a steady progression. A lot of times you will find in town records, they had planned on erecting monuments very, very early on, and then it never really got going, or they didn't have the funding. Funding is also often pulled from sometimes the state, individual people giving $1 here, $1 there, GAR groups, the Grand Army of the Republic Veterans Organizations that are raising funds. So the designs are different, the funding is different, so there's a lot of different ways that they go about doing this. And if you've ever worked on a committee, especially a university committee, you know how difficult it is to get anything done. And so the fact that it took them 50, 60, 70 years to put up a monument, it's okay with me. All right? The Waterbury Soldiers Monument is, as I said, particularly unique for a variety of reasons. One, because of the overall design of it. It is very tall. It is at the far end of the Waterbury Green. It has got Lady Liberty on the top, and you can see the other statues that are down around the bottom of it. And the various statues represent different things. They are different soldiers. And the idea that the Civil War monuments are meant to express is civilian soldiers. Those who have dropped whatever it is they're doing at the time the war begins to take on the accoutrements of war, to lift up a rifle, to take a cartridge box, to put on a uniform, and to go to war. It is not undifferent from today. We do not have a draft today. We have an entire volunteer military. All of the soldiers, men and women who are serving in the United States military today have enlisted. They've decided to go from civilian life to military life. That's what many of these monuments are meant to represent. And if you look at the various statues, you will see men from different walks of life. You'll see the same thing on the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch over here in Bushnell Park, where it is young men who are farmers, who are mechanics, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and each of the statues represent these different walks of life and going forward. So here you can see a mechanic down by his leg. It's kind of difficult to see, but down by his leg you can see a cog, a piece of machinery. There is that's a little bit of a better close-up there. You see the cog down next to his leg? The idea is that he was a blacksmith and he went forward to war. He's got a sword in one hand, yet civilian clothes on. In honor of the patriotism and to perpetuate the memory of the 900 brave men who went forth from this town to fight in the war for the Union. This monument has been erected by their townsmen, that all who come after them may be mindful of their deeds and fail not in the day of trial to emulate their example, that the generations to come might know them. This is one of the things that makes the Waterbury Soldiers Monument particularly unique. There are only three monuments now in the state of Connecticut that deal with the issue of slavery. This is one of them. You can see behind her head, it says Emancipation. To her right is, to our left, to her right, is a young white boy looking up at her. To her left is a young black boy. And it's difficult to tell from the detail, but if you go down into Waterbury and look at this, it's very apparent. The little boy is an African-American boy. He's sitting on top of a bale of cotton, quite symbolic of a war over cotton. He is reaching his hand up and touching a book. And the idea is it is meant to symbolize the educational uplift of the race, that this will be the true future of this freed race. Under her right foot is a cannon with broken shackles. Very, very symbolic, the idea of emancipation and what this war was over. There's another one of the characters on another one of the statues. This is the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch. You'll note on this that it has, let me just fast forward, again, very specific statues representing the same thing as the Waterbury Monument, that it is different civilians who come forward from different walks of life. There's a stonemason. There's a young man. You got chaffs of wheat. His hand is on a plow. There is, you see the piece of machinery down by the leg again? Same idea. Still civilians who dropped everything and went forward to war. This then is the other monument, another statue. You have an African American. If you look at his right hand on your left, you'll see a chain that's dropped down from his wrist, and the shackle is broken. In his left hand is a writing slate. It says ABC on it. The same exact idea as the Waterbury Monument. It is meant to symbolize that education will be the key to the uplift of this race that has been freed in this war. Now, I said that this is particularly unique because there are only 3 monuments in the entire state of Connecticut that specifically deal with the issue of slavery or emancipation. And that is key. And I had said earlier that you can understand the history of the Civil War because of the monuments themselves. Because the war, for most white Americans, white Northerners, the war is not about emancipation. It's not about abolition. It's not about freedom and social and political equality for African Americans. That is something that is taken by African Americans in the midst of this war. They are the ones. In many respects, they free themselves. Lincoln is late. He comes in and emancipates slaves primarily to save the Union, not for social and political equality. And the monuments, I mean, it's a bigger story than the way I'm laying it out right now. But the monuments tell the story. It's why out of 130 some odd monuments, only 2 or 3 specifically deal with the issue of slavery. The third one that deals with it, another image of the arch, the third one that deals with it is this, the Connecticut 29th Regiment, erected in 2008. The Connecticut 29th was the first black regiment from the state of Connecticut. They were mustered in late 1863. It only took till the 21st century to erect a monument specifically to black service. I think we've taken a little while to catch up, and maybe we haven't caught up completely, but this was erected in 2008 in New Haven, only the 3rd monument in the state to specifically deal with slavery, race, emancipation. And there you go, the Connecticut 29th Colored Regiment. Here's just another example of a Civil War monument, something that's a little different. You've got a soldier standing atop. This is Thomaston Soldiers Monument, 1902. And so what I'd like to do now is, I don't want to take up too much time. I wanted to give you a basic outline of the history of monuments in the state of Connecticut. And I'm going to quickly go through. There's so many monuments to show you. But I want to come back to this point of how it is we remember. And one of the ways is through the monuments. One of the ways are through letters. This was a writing generation. Everybody wrote letters. I don't even know if half of the kids in here especially can actually write a letter anymore. We do it all through texts and emails, and electronic media can disappear. So how are we going to remember the stories of what happened in today's current wars? And I started off today by saying we've got to start from, the Civil War period. The monuments are meant to help us remember the many, many letters and diaries and photos and images. All of those things are meant to have us remember. How are we going to remember the history of war today? How are soldiers, if you're an historian, how are you going to approach a soldier? My nephew, who's back in Afghanistan this week. How am I going to know what his experiences were? How am I going to know the experiences of Vietnam soldiers or in the first Iraq War? How am I going to go as an historian and go and research that? I can find some records from the military, but I also want to know what were their thoughts. The nature of the history of warfare has changed a lot over the years. It used to be all about great generals and battles and strategy. And over the last 50 years or so, we've become so much more interested in what was the experience, what was the life of the average soldier. What did they go and do? This is why so many families, especially with Ancestry.com and things like this, so many families have become interested in their own family's history, and they want to tell the story of their ancestor, especially if they served in World War II or in Vietnam or in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, or, all of these various trials and conflicts that have existed throughout our history. How are you going to do it today when we're such a digital generation? Well, the answer is simple. We do it digitally. And this brings us to the Veterans History Project. And the Veterans History Project is an organization that is at Central Connecticut State University. It is conducted and run by my good friend Eileen Hurst. She actually developed this project. She was already interviewing veterans and cataloging the interviews with the Library of Congress. And one day we were on a fire alarm that had gone off in the building, and we were standing in the parking lot at CCSU, and we were chatting about it, and I said, well, why don't you do something more with it? Why don't you build this up a little more? And we got chatting, and the Veterans History Project has been built out of, in many respects, out of that conversation and out of Eileen's incredible work with working with the Library of Congress. And so this is housed at the Center for Public Policy and Social Research at CCSU. She's got a set of unbelievable students, both undergraduate and graduate students, who have been involved in this project and have been going out to veterans from Connecticut and elsewhere and interviewing these men and women and sitting down with them and creating this amazing database. And so now what I want to do is introduce the students so that they can give you their half of this presentation and hope that you get a linkage, an understanding between the experiences in wartime of men from the Civil War period and men and women from later periods in our nation's history. And what they're going to do is they're going to juxtapose the two. They're going to read you a letter from the Civil War times, and then they're going to show you a video clip from more modern times so you can get an idea of, again, how it is we remember and what the Veterans History Project is really about and how we think about those long-term connections over time of soldiers' experiences. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Brianna McGuckin right here, Owen Rogers, and Tim Jones. And I'm now going to leave it to them.
Minister Samuel Fisk of the 14th Regiment Connecticut Volunteers from Madison, Connecticut, wrote on September 18, 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, "I have at last turned over a new and bloody leaf in my experience and seen a battle, and am now writing you, sitting in a newly low field, all strewn with the dead of our gallant Union soldiers, still unburied, lying as they fell. The battle itself was a scene of indescribable confusion. Troops didn't know what they were expected to do, and sometimes, in the excitement, fired at their own men. The excitement of the battle comes in the day of it, but the horrors of it 2 or 3 days after. The air grows terribly offensive from the unburied bodies, and a pestilence will speedily be bred if they are not put underground. Think now of the horrors of such a scene as lies all around us, for there are hundreds of horses too, all mangled and putrefying, scattered everywhere. And yet, I saw over all this scene of devastation and horror yesternight one of the loveliest double rainbows that ever mortal eyes looked upon. It was as if heaven sat serene over human woes and horrors and crowned all the earthly evils with the promise of ultimate, most glorious good. War is waste, waste, ruin, and destruction." Also in September 1862, Fisk wrote, "The simple fact of the matter is that the soldiers universally, every man of them so far as my observation goes, dislike war and dislike battles as all good citizen soldiers should. Dislike to be killed with shell or Minié bullets, or to be starved to death, or to be marched to death, just as much as other men do. Indeed, they are all other men than soldiers by profession of preference, but they have come to war reluctantly from the pressure of urgent necessity and a strong sense of duty, and they want the war over within the quickest possible time." In January 1863, he wrote on winter campaigns, "It means the soldiers' wet feet every day of the march, the cold ground to lie upon, and insufficient food for them to eat. It means coughs, colds, consumption, rheumatism, and fevers. a row of unmarked graves all along the track of the Army, and desolation and mourning to thousands of pleasant homes. It means the pain of seeing in every company brave fellows sinking right down to death before your eyes, with no possibility of helping them or even doing much to soothe their last hours. It means if battle comes, the wounded left to freeze in the severity of the nights or to mingle their blood with the deep mud on which they lie. It means every possible form of human suffering, privation, and hardship. Fisk was wounded on May 6, 1864, at the Battle of the Wilderness, and died on May 22nd at a hospital in Fredericksburg, surrounded by his wife and family.
The last thing they said to us when we got through bridge training was, in 90 days, boys, you could either be killed or you will have killed. That's when they put us on a train, and we took off. And we sent to different parts of the country, to disembarkment places where to go overseas.
I landed. It was in the afternoon around this time. At that time of the year, the days are long, and it was dusk before we got to the ridge at night. It was dark before we got to the ridge at night. What was hard at the time, I had never seen people decapitated like they were blown up and things. I had never seen that. And what was hard is the tides coming in, and there was a place, if you stayed over there, that as long as the tide stayed out, you were safe. But the tide was coming in, forcing all of us to expose ourselves or drown. We weren't about to do that. And when we did that, we had to run for cover, whatever we could find. And if all hell broke loose, we hit the beach, and what it did, the weight of that equipment pushed the bulkhead, the landing pad, it pushed it open, and it blocked it in a way. We had to get around that to get to the beach. Otherwise, you're exposed right there. And that was hell. That was hell. People were dying all over. I don't know. I was just lucky. I was just lucky. It wasn't meant for me to die that day. Or even the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge, it wasn't as bad as firepower, but the cold of the Battle of the Bulge, that was wicked. That was wicked.
We came back, and on our way back, a Japanese submarine decided they'd let us have it. They fired 4 torpedoes at us, and 2 of them hit midships on the starboard side. And I'm on the flight deck. Let's see if I can point out. I'm on the flight deck up here. I'm away from the fire, but I can't get towards that direction. So I went to the edge of here, and I could see down here where these fellows were falling into the burning oil. Well, I decided I'm not going to do that. So I went to the port side, which was over here, and I took my sneakers off, and I ran across the flight deck, and I jumped over the flames, which was a 57-foot jump. Well, that's almost 6 stories high. It was pretty high. And when I hit the water, I had my Mae West on, and I hadn't buckled it on the crotch, and it slipped right off over my head, and I descended, I don't know how deep, but I found that I was running out of air.
Our first mission across the border, we flew over a checkpoint that had been established by another division, and we were a flight of 5, and I was in the lead aircraft. So as we were coming into the landing zone, I was looking to make sure we had everybody with us. And as we were flying over the checkpoint, right under chalk, I think it was 2 or 3, a car bomb went off. So I looked back, and all I saw was a huge explosion. Had no idea what was going on. We landed, dropped off our troops, took back off, and I was, part of my job was to count and make sure we had everybody, so I could let my pilot know. And I only counted 4 helicopters. So I started to think that the huge ball of smoke was one of ours. It turned out that the LZ they had given us was too small. It wouldn't fit all the aircraft. So they had to move sort of left a little bit farther into a different field and land. So I finally saw them pop up and join the flight. So it was a little intense for a second there.
Sergeant Fred Lucas of the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery from Goshen, Connecticut, was camped at the defenses outside Washington, D.C. in July 1863, writing that a letter from Abner Wadhams to Corporal W. states that many are desponding at home, that you're looking on the dark side of this contest, and that patriotism is at a comparative low ebb there. Can it be that you at home are losing faith in the Army, the administration, and our cause? Are you becoming doubtful of the final result? O ye of little faith, you at home, who knew as it were nothing at all concerning this rebellion, can you give way to fear or faint-heartedness when those in the field fighting with their own hands the battles of this war still keep courage and continue to fight on confident success? Don't let us hear of such things concerning those whom we left behind. To you we look for strength, for aid and support, and will you not grant us this assistance? Then raise up the old flag on all occasions, and let the starry emblem of the principles for which we contend kiss the breezes of our native home at every holiday occasion. During May 1864, the 2nd redeployed to the front line. This would be their first taste of combat, and as they marched, Lucas remarked, "This is truly a desolate country. War has stripped every vestige of civilization from the land, even the trees and bushes in the vicinity of the route we have traveled. We have passed several old rebel encampments and have seen the marks of skirmishes and fights. Trains of wounded men are continually coming in from the front, and those who die are buried along the way." In June 1864, after the Battle of Cold Harbor, Lucas wrote, "The romance of war is never realized. Its reality is far a different thing. The description of brave and impetuous charges, valiant deeds of heroism, and personal exhibitions of daring and courage look well on paper and please the public taste. But the real battlefield, with its woe and carnage and bloodshed, pain and misery, groans and cries, curses and prayers of the wounded and dying, is indeed a scene which my pen cannot describe. Today, as we brought in our dead and wounded and found who they were, I witnessed many a sad meeting. Brothers have found brothers among the dead, fathers their sons and sons their fathers, and old and familiar friends, the same ritual."
The hospital was set up by a ammunition depot, which it should never have been. You shouldn't put a hospital. We had big tents with great big red crosses, but Germans were firing from, somebody said 20 miles away, I don't know. But we got a direct hit in our hospital one night, and one of the patients were killed, and so they shouldn't have been there.
And at that time, the white soldier would eat first, the prisoner of war would eat next, and the African-American soldier would eat last, and he had to clean up the kitchen.
We were trying to pull out a reconnaissance team that had been encircled by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And when we went into the zone, it's probably the only time I've ever seen anybody actually shoot at me that I could see. This guy in a green uniform stood up and pointed his weapon and fired. And the crew chief called and said that the gunner had been hit. So we left. We couldn't even land. We just sort of pulled up and then took off again. The lead plane was shot up pretty badly. They went back to Dong Ha, and I went to the ship because I wanted the guy that was shot to get the best care that I thought he could get, and I figured the ship was better than a field hospital.
The engines cut out just as we reached the opening. There was a large field of elephant grass, and we basically were able to do a not a very pretty, uncontrolled crash, but semi-controlled, and the ship rolled on its side once over and then ended up on its side, completely on its side. And we got out, we always met to the right front of the aircraft if you had a crash, so you knew where to see whether you had everyone. So three of us were there, but the fourth guy wasn't there. And we went back in, and my crew chief actually was the gunner. He had been trapped under the aircraft. His head had been pinned under the aircraft, basically, with his helmet on. And his arms and legs were flailing around. I'm standing down, looking now down to the compartment where he is. And so we jumped down in there and tried to get him out. We couldn't get him out. He was pinned. The other aircraft, carrying the other troops, now wounded guys, got out. So all the Special Forces guys got out of the other aircraft, set up a perimeter for us. These guys one guy had a belly wound where you could see part of his intestines hanging out. He's now setting up a perimeter for us. No one left. We ended up eventually realizing his helmet strap was what was holding his head under the aircraft. So I got a knife that we carried and reached underneath there and just cut that, and then we basically ripped his body out from underneath there and out of the helmet, and was able to get the crew chief out about 20 minutes after trying everything we could, rocking the aircraft, trying to lift it with the other aircraft. The bad guys now, the command and control ship's telling us the NVA are closing in on where we are and get out of there. And the Special Forces guys are engaging them at the perimeter.
It's been a long 5-year struggle coping with what happened to me because it wasn't all pleasant and it all wasn't, pretty sunsets and sunrises and lots of water. It's sending out airplanes loaded wingtip to wingtip with bombs, and then it will come back with any. And realizing where they're going and what they're doing with that.
Sergeant Benjamin Hurst of the 14th Regiment Connecticut Volunteers from Rockville, Connecticut, also experienced the horrors of Antietam, writing on September 18, 1862. Awoke on the battlefield of yesterday and, after getting some coffee, began to look around. Soon saw war without romance. There were dead men lying around everywhere, some with their heads shattered to pieces, others with their bowels protruding, while others had lost their legs and arms. What my feelings were I cannot describe, but I hope to God to never see such another sight again.
So the Navy ran the ship, so they fed us there. They gave us food to eat before we went out. But I remember because I messed it and I picked up the food, was walking along the rail, and I looked down there and there's a dead American sergeant floating by me, upside down, and he still had on his steel helmet and all. And that was the first realize that you're in a real battle here.
The reservoir was loaded with dead soldiers from one end to the other. And we walked and we walked and we walked, could not find Whitey. We kept on walking. We saw an M1 sticking up from the ground. And I said, Jose, let's go check that out. So we walk and we get in there. We're walking over Chinese bodies. And we walked over bodies and we got to him and I looked and I said, Joe, what? It's Whitey. They shot him. And they bayoneted him and left it in him. And that was sad. That was very, very sad.
I think you have to shut off some of your emotions. After, seeing, kids being killed and, people being hurt and maimed and your friends being wounded and your friends being killed, you have to shut your emotions off at that time. It absolutely affects you. But at that time, you can't let it affect you because you still have a job to do. You still have other people to take care of. And if you let that affect you, you're not going to be able to,
There was this one time we were on the Gold Platts and I heard this scary click. I wasn't paying attention. For some reason, we were getting into it so deep that I wasn't paying attention to the rounds. Like, I count my rounds in my head. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so when I get to 30, I'm like, I know I'm gonna go and switch like around 29. So I have a fresh mag. And I remember that was scary. They say it in boot camp. They say it in infantry combat school. They say it in RIP. They say it in all kinds of schools you go to. That the scariest thing over here is a click, and it is the scariest thing over here because I was moving while I was firing, and while I was moving, it went click, and the charging handle, the bolt locked back, and I realized I had no more rounds. And I was like, oh, it's one of those weird things that you get this tingling sensation through your body. And it was just like, and I still made it to my location, but it's one of those things that I'll remember that I always got to keep in my head.
Private Justice Silliman of the 17th Regiment Connecticut Volunteers from New Canaan, Connecticut, was stationed in Jacksonville, Florida during April 1865, where he witnessed Union prisoners of war. On Friday the 28th at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the front of our returning Union prisoners came in sight of our picket line, and before dark, more than 2,000 had arrived in town, having marched from Baldwin, a distance of 20 miles since morning. They were like dark unearthly shadows than like anything human, surpassing in horror any of the horrid-looking pictures of returned prisoners published in the illustrated newspapers and showing plainly of the hell from which they have too recently emerged. Many of them were nearly naked and as black as soot, and they were in a starving condition, their only food having been coarse Indian meal and occasionally a small piece of live meat. I do not think you could have endured the sight, and I'm very thankful that you are living where you do not see the terrible effects of this war. I will not pain you with the accounts I have listened to of the horrors of the Andersonville prison pen and of the fiendish inhumanity of the enemy. I am told that the bodies of 18,000 of our brave men have been thrown in the trenches at Andersonville.
There was an escape, but somebody squealed on them, and as they were coming out of the ground, Germans were waiting for them and immediately shut their mouth up, cuffed their mouths so they couldn't scream or holler or anything else, and they were carried off immediately. And what happened was, when they did escape, all those that escaped were supposed to escape. They all got out, but they were all captured right then and there. And the Germans cremated their body, and they brought them back into camp in a big box, and they said, "Here's your prisoners."
Captain William DeForest of the 12th Regiment Connecticut Volunteer Infantry from New Haven, Connecticut, wrote during April 1863, "Oh, the horrors of marching on blistered feet. I do not mean a single blister, as big as a pea, but a series of blisters, each as large as $1, or, to judge by one's sensations, as large as a cartwheel. I have had them one under the other, on the heel, behind the heel, on the ball of the foot, on every toe, a network, a labyrinth, an archipelago of agony. Heat, hunger, thirst, and fatigue are nothing compared with this torment. In describing the miseries of marching, I must not forget the dust. The movement of so many thousands of feet throws up such dense and prodigious clouds that one who has not witnessed the phenomenon will find it difficult to imagine it in all its vastness and nuisance. The officers dodge from side to side of the road to escape the pulverous suffocation, and the men, bound to their fours, choke desperately along in the midst of it. The faces become grimed out of all human semblance, the eyelashes are loaded, the hair discolored, and the uniform turns to the color of the earth." In May 1863, he wrote on the glory of battle, "Certain military authors who never heard a bullet whistle have written copiously for the Marines to the general effect that the fighting is delightful. It is not. It is just tolerable. You can put up with it, but you can't honestly praise it. Baiting a few flashes of elation which come in moments of triumph or in the height of a breathless charge, when the air is all a yell and the earth is all aflame, the man who does not dread to die or to be mutilated is a lunatic. The man who, dreading these things, still faces them for the sake of duty and honor is a hero."
It's going to burn. It's going to burn. And so that's one way he was trying to break contact. Everybody on that operation got wounded. The team sergeant got hit in the head. He was beyond control anymore. because he couldn't even think. So I took charge of it. When I took charge of it, I made sure that Stephen's body got out of there first. I pulled him back. And then after that, we started getting the men together. I got on the radio and got a hold of the fast mover, Smokey. And I told Smokey where we were at, what kind of fix we were in and all that. He come down and he said, okay, I'm going to shoot at WP. Tell me where you're from that. And he did. And from there, I says, I gave him the coordinates and everything. And the big fast movers started coming down. And I said, now we need some ships. Everybody's wounded. We need some Hueys. Everybody here is wounded. Okay, on the way. We got the Boat Rights Organization. Everything was right there all the time.
And one day that I was eating in the can rations were like this, like a tuna fish can. It's kind of flat and round. And I opened it up one hand with my knife or however I got it and pulled it open. And I went to eat, and there was flies, 1,000 flies that flew in there on my food. And I couldn't. I had to hold my can with one hand and eat with the other hand. And by the time I put the flies out and get back there, those flies were back there, and they were there, and there was, I'd say, probably an inch and a half of flies. So what I did, I was so hungry, I just put that knife in front, and I ate the flies and all. And that's exactly the truth, and that's the way it was. I said, the hell with it. And they didn't taste too bad, if I remember correctly, but I had to eat. There was approximately 5,000 dead people on that island, so there's a lot of flies, you know.
All right. And when we brought the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines in April of '67, they were the first Marines that were in country with the M16. And the weapon fired fine off the ship. But there was a lot of Marines that were killed behind that weapon because it was jamming in combat. That's the last thing that you want to have. And they tried to blame the Marines for not properly taking care of it. But how do you crawl up the side of a mountain with the rifle and keep it clean all the way up? You don't.
And you never want to land with an armed bomb, no matter how vital the bomb is. It could be a big one or a little one. But Bill Dolan, the bombardier, and I had gone into the bomb bay, and we had pulled the little cotter pins that safety the bombs. Well, we never dropped the bombs because we had this engine problem. So when we landed in Dallas, Texas, Bill and I went into the coffee shop, and we were smoking, and we put our hands in our pockets, and we realized we still got all the pins. All the cotter pins. And we got a bunch of armed, they're only 100-pounders, but they could do some damage, especially on landing an airplane with malfunction. So anyway, we sneak out to the airplane. We put the cotter pins back in, and because the airplane was so new, so secret, when we landed, we had an MP surround the airplane, a bunch of MPs. So we showed our dog tags and all the identification, which we had because the airplane was special. So we put the cotter piece back. Then the pilot shows up and he says, "Hey, did you guys ever put those pins back?" Of course. You don't think we would land with an armed bomb. So Dolan and I were sworn to secrecy.
A sailor came to me with a can of peaches. Can you imagine that? A sailor gave me a can of peaches. He opened it up for me. And he gave me a toothbrush and a comb and I think some toothpaste. And a can of peaches. Because we had lived on Tulagi on, we had only had a day's rations when we went ashore there. So we lived on coconuts and stolen Japanese rice. I mean, recovered Japanese rice. gave me those peaches, big can of peaches, and that syrup. It was champagne. Beautiful that guy was.
Well, you know, our goal today has been to kind of give you a big picture idea about experiences of wartime. To start with the history of the monuments and to give you an idea of how it is the Civil War generation attempted to make future generations, all of us, remember, and how to learn about what they experienced during that time period. And what Brianna and Owen have done is read you the specific letters of certain Civil War soldiers and talk about their experiences. And it's everything from what you see in these video clips, from what their experience in battle was like, what happened when they were prisoners of war, and then also just the everyday things that, you know, a lot of the time in warfare, and I know this from speaking with a number of my students who are soldiers and from my nephew and others, is that, you know, war in a lot of times are flashes of activity, and then there's a tremendous amount of downtime. And what do you do in those downtimes? That's when you're really living your life. And you need to find things to do, and you need to find stuff to eat, and, you know, peaches that he enjoyed so much that he equated peaches with champagne. That Civil War soldiers are eating stuff like rancid salt pork and what is called hardtack, which is this biscuit that if you went to the Museum of Connecticut History, you could probably get a piece that is every bit as good today as the day that it was made. I mean, absolutely nasty stuff, and they're dealing with this everyday stuff. The heat, what Brianna had talked about, the blisters on one of the soldiers' feet and the marching. And I mean, this is the lives of soldiers. And whether you're talking about a soldier from the Civil War period, or from the Korean War, or World War II, or Vietnam, or more present day soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, they have all had similar experiences that carry throughout the history of our understanding of warfare. And, you know, as time continues on, you know, we've had monuments, Civil War monuments that have recently gone up. We have others that are still going to be going up. And as we continue as a society, we will continue to have more monuments. Guaranteed that Connecticut will be home to monuments of soldiers who have fallen in Afghanistan and Iraq. If you go to West Hartford, where I live, right down by the town center, just a few years ago, they erected a brand new war memorial that has the global war on terror listed on it, and it has an open end date. You know, what will that mean for us as a society? So, you know, I really think, you know, the point today is twofold. One is that idea of how it is we remember, and to look at monuments with new eyes, to think about them a little bit more and what they actually mean, whatever the monument is, but to think about it a little bit more. And then also to give that consideration of how it is we remember. To hear or read Civil War soldiers is one thing. It's neat. And you often, the more letters you read, the more you feel that you've gotten to know a soldier, and you get to understand their writing, and you actually feel for them. When you get to watch the video clips, you actually get to see somebody and see what their facial expressions are, what the tone of their voice is like. And, you know, the man who you saw, John Pease, who was just a couple of clips ago, who talked about eating the can of tuna with all the flies on it, he passed away 1 week ago. Okay? So again, you know, his daughter is the dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at CCSU. And so I've known her for years. But to be able to, you know, I got to meet him several times. We actually wrote something about him. And then to be able to see him in this video clip, it's nice because all of posterity, those who knew him and those who will never know him, get to see him. These are all brief video clips. The Veterans History Project is an absolutely remarkable resource. You can go to their website. If you just go to Google or one of the search engines and write in Veterans History Project CCSU, the site will come right up. And you can search it by, if you know a particular soldier's name, or you can do it by conflict. World War II, World War II, Vietnam, Korea. You can do it by gender. So if you're looking just for the stories of women, and it is a project that has been going for a number of years and is ongoing and will continue to go for many years. So it really is quite a remarkable resource. So thank you so much for coming today, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
I would like to thank our presenters today, thank Matt, and thank all of you for coming today. I think this was a very interesting program. I urge you all to visit that website and to really take in these videos. And they also have written journals by soldiers and photographs, so please do that. And thank you again for coming.